Thanks everybody for having me here. Before I get into it, I guess a little bit of background of why this conference particularly has been really valuable to me and interesting to me today. About 3 months ago, I decided to sort of join this world of instability, a lack of a guaranteed paycheck, and started Threadline on my own, and have sort of been taking furious notes today now about what do I actually need to do to grow this into something that I hope is meaningful and beneficial to many folks. So it's something I've just started, and it's one of those things where it's, you know, in the past when you are part of an organization, there's like an identity that you get, and now I have to re-explain to my family what exactly I do. So this has also been really helpful because, yes, I've got clients that are trying to figure out what I do, but I've got a brother who keeps asking me what I do, and he thinks it's with computers still. So what I wanted to talk about today was the physics of stories. And as a caveat, I will not be talking about how to actually sort of communicate your story. This isn't like a communication technique, which I have talked about in the past in regards to storytelling and the role of storytelling. But what I'm going to be talking about is sort of the physics of creating a narrative that leads to a more meaningful relationship with your clients. Now, for me, physics was an interesting sort of stumbling block when I got to it, in that I think about story a lot. I'm pursuing and about to finish a doctorate in narrative psychology, and one day I was there and I was thinking about the role of tension in stories. What's interesting about the role of tension in stories is tension from a physics standpoint is a source of energy. And in high school, physics was the only AP course I took that I actually passed on the AP exam, and I got a 4. And because of that, I went to Northwestern undergrad for engineering and realized I'm not an engineer at all. That was just sort of a lucky fluke. But in physics, there's what's called the First Law of Thermodynamics. And I swear, going to teach you all about physics all over again. But the First Law of Thermodynamics is that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, simply transformed from one state into another state. And it hit me that when it comes to our relationships, and especially our relationships with clients, that there is the first law of narrative dynamics. Excuse me, did I pass it? The first law of narrative dynamics, that clients can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed from one client to another. Now, what do I mean by this? And this is, I think, sort of the big idea I want you to take away, is that I don't mean you've got this really awful client and you're going to destroy them and you're going to recreate this really wonderful client. That's not what I mean at all. However, clients are living their own stories and they're transforming through those stories, and you play a role in that transformation. So the energy and the relationship and the role that you play, the services that you provide, help them move from one state of great need into another. So we transform them. Now, when we think about how we actually connect and market and engage with clients, we often thought about it in this way, right? I've got benefits, they've got needs. No matter what, they always needed the benefits that I had, and I've been in market research now for about 15 years or so, and whenever you do market research, right, and whether it's the pharma world or consumer packaged goods, they always seem to reveal these needs that your product is the perfect product for, right? Your service is the perfect service for. Everything that they've just said is why they should hire us. There's a challenge with this, that it comes off sort of meaningless in many regards, right? It feels very salesy, that no matter what, your solution is the solution, right? And the last thing as we sort of go through this is to feel like the bad stereotype of the salesperson, right? That is there just to sort of trick you, to kind of get you to buy something that you perhaps didn't actually need and didn't realize or think that you would ever need. There's an example. I was just at a conference with my father, who runs a nonprofit in South Florida. We're at this nonprofit conference, and we're at the networking event, and someone comes up about 45 minutes into the night, clearly having had a couple of drinks by then. He turns to my father, who as an executive director gets a lot of folks coming up to want to talk to him, and he says, "I'm just the man you need to talk to." It was the most awkward experience ever. My father is not a big fan of that sort of thing, quickly shut it down, and we moved away. And that was sort of how we've approached, not necessarily the way we actually talk to our clients, but certainly the way we think about how we position these things. For a long time, it starts to feel like we're just sort of trying to identify that pickup line that finally works, right, in the bar. And it's got to be more than that. And I think it has to be more meaningful than that. And so this is why we talk about, in many cases, this need pyramid. And if you don't know who Abraham Maslow is, you probably have used one of his pyramids, or at least a sort of watered down version of his pyramid. He created the pyramid of needs, right, that was identifying human behavior and motivation, and that it sort of broke down. At first, you've got to have, shelter and food before you can get to social needs, and finally, sort of what is essentially actualization. It was a wonderful approach to trying to understand what people need. It was well thought out. It was certainly breakthrough at the time. The problem is that it's actually not really backed by any of the science. Maslow's pyramid is pretty broken in regards to understanding how people decide or choose things. It's a very linear approach. It assumes that I've got to address each of these needs in level before I actually make a choice. And as all of us know, that's not how we make choices, right? If we did, there would certainly not be as many meat-based sandwiches over on the bar that I know you're waiting for me to finish so you can get to. It would be all salads and maybe like a little dose of vitamins at the end, right? We would be going to the gym all the time, things like that. But we don't make decisions in that way. We aren't linear people. We are people who are essentially living through a story. Now, a bit about what I mean to live through a story from a psychological perspective. All of us are living through this story, and this is your client who's crying because they haven't found you yet to fulfill their needs. But we are all living in a story. We are all going through the world trying to make sense of that world by creating narratives, by creating meaning out of the world through narrative. And that's what narratives do for us. Narratives make sense of the chaos and start to organize it into something, right? Whether it's in our personal lives, it's in our public lives, or it's in our professional lives. We face something, we realize that we've got to make sense of it. And our mind does this without us knowing, really. It creates this narrative structure, gives us this sort of flow that feels very story-like. Now, when you break that down in regards to the way clients live, it looks a bit like this. This is my client. This is my just amazing design skills it wasn't even Photoshop. I just literally drew this in PowerPoint. And this is your client, right? And we talk about those needs, and sometimes we talk about them as tensions that clients have. And they've all got these tensions, right? So they are working towards this objective that they've been given either by a marketing department or by some design department or the C-suite. They're facing challenges in accomplishing those goals, right? Whether it be the timeline. They are looking for maybe some sort of rich insights, some deep insights. They've also got budget restraints that are pulling them back. They're trying to do this, let's say, within an under sort of staffed department. And they're trying to create something that becomes really meaningful and influences the world, right? Or influences at least their organization. When you look at tension this way, what I realized is it is that energy, right? It is these opposing forces that are pulling it apart and creating that tension for the individual. The person who wants to accomplish this goal but can't is held back by a number of different dynamics. There's likely more than this. And sometimes they're often very personal or very intimate sort of barriers and obstacles and drivers that are driving this. Now, the challenge with this, it takes us back to the law of narrative dynamics, right? Which is that clients can either be created or destroyed. They can only be transformed from one client to another. And the question becomes, well, what client do they transform to? What do we take them to? And that's where we have to identify what that end goal is. And the end goal isn't just the completion of a project or even just the answering of a question. The end goal is who are they now that they've been through this, right? Who do they want to become? And that's what I call client plus. So you've got client who's here, just rife with tension, tearing their head out, crying as earlier, and they want to become something else. They want to become the person who has influenced the organization. They want to become the person who has changed or transformed the package, the product, the service. And our clients are going through the same thing, right? And they want to be that, and we can play a role in helping them through that. And if we start to do that, what will happen is that we will see we can potentially start to address some of those tensions, right? We can address the barriers that are pulling them back. Perhaps we can do it in the right time frame or for less budget. Perhaps we can find a way to address some other need that they've got, to help them influence the team that they're facing or to build their reputation within that organization. And even we can perhaps help them extend the strengths that they already have, help them realize a greater way they can influence and move towards that objective. And if we do that, if we start to help them do that, we can start to move them towards Client Plus. Now, I call this out, and I'm using this very, very basic, simple visual for a reason, is that oftentimes when we attempt to market and create a relationship with our clients, we focus on the periphery, right? We say that we've got this benefit, you've got this need. And the challenge with that is that when we only focus on the periphery, we are only competing against our competitors, right? On whether or not we can do that as fast, whether or not we can do that as cheaply, whether or not we can do that better than them, right? It becomes a very tactical sort of marketing plan and approach. If we focus on the periphery, we're missing the thing that we're actually trying to transform, which is the client in the center. So now when we focus on the client, when we focus on the center of this transformation, we focus on what is actually being transformed, yes, you've still got to communicate and talk about those benefits and talk about your services and talk about the budget and the time and all that sort of stuff, but it becomes centered around their ultimate transformation, is how do we get you to this point through these services? And that becomes essentially the data that supports and proves your story is actually achievable and attainable with them. And I wanted to share an example with you all that I identified. And this one, I've got two examples for you of how this works and why I've seen this work. Is I went to Amazon. And on Amazon, I started looking at thermostats. This thermostat on the left is one of the best-selling thermostats on Amazon. It's $25, gets about 4.5, close to 5 stars out of the thousands of reviews that it's got, right? Now, most of us don't think about our thermostats all that much, right? It doesn't really play that meaningful of a role to us. If you probably met someone and they said, this is my thermostat, you'd probably still be looking at them with a blank face because it tells you nothing about who they are, right? This is the thermostat that came in your house. In some cases, you forgot it was there. The only time it presents itself is when you're sort of battling over what temperature you actually want the house to be. And it does two things really well. It measures temperature and it regulates temperature, right? There isn't a ton of transformation here when it comes to who's buying these sorts of things. And it wasn't a category that did a lot of transformation until this happened, right? And we've got smart thermostats in our homes. Smart thermostats transformed what it meant to be in the thermostat industry, to purchase a thermostat, right? And now if someone were to tell you, I own a Nest, or I own Ecobee, or I own one of those other ones, you can start to build a picture of who they are, the kind of person they might be, the other things they might have in their home. And it starts to create a story and express that story in a clear way. Now, when you do this, yes, they measure, right, temperature, and they regulate temperature, and there's likely still battles over the temperature that you desire within your house, but it also tracks, and it helps give you data, and it helps inform you, and it helps you identify, maybe you're also trying to be really green, it gives you tips on how to save or conserve that energy within your home. And because it helps those individuals transform from being someone who's a sort of pretty dumb when it comes to the data within their house to someone that is now pretty smart to the data in their house, they can charge $250. That's a 10 times fold for having a meaningful relationship with the consumer, right? From 25 to 250. For not doing really all that much at the core, then helping them transform, right? It still regulates temperature, it still controls your thermostat or your air conditioner, your heat, but now it's benefiting from a 10-time greater sort of purchase rate. Now, this is obviously in sort of the packaged good world. I wanted to have an example that was sort of in the service world. And I don't know how many people have heard of Slack or are using Slack, have adopted Slack within their organizations. It's one, as when I started the company, the first thing I did was I started Slack, and I realized I'm the only guy in Slack on my company Slack channel. So I send myself GIFs and tell myself I'm doing a good job, things like that. It's a lonely Slack experience, but Slack did something really interesting because inter-office communication tools existed already, right? Whether it was via text, via email, Microsoft Messenger, Skype, things like that. That existed already. And they knew they couldn't really create a product that was significantly better from a feature standpoint. And they do have some really interesting features that are really engaging and some often very time-wasting, like their GIF capabilities. But they realized they had to do something else in order to create adoption. What they did is that they found the first person in the company that signed up for Slack, and they transformed them, right? They focused on who they were, on teaching them about the tool, training them in the benefits of the tool, and helping them understand how to communicate the benefits of Slack to the rest of their organization. So they took that Slack user, who might have been sort of the groundbreaker within their organization, and said, let's make you the expert in Slack within your organization. And now everyone turns to that person when it comes to how to use Slack, and they become the expert within it. And Slack has conferences you can attend now to learn even more. And they continue to build that person, whether it's the person in HR or IT or whoever, but they realized that we wouldn't start to compete in a real way unless we were transforming the people who are using our service. So what does that all mean, and how do we do it? I have a couple of tips, and I call them essentially sort of the 5 C's, if you will, of narrative. And the first is to define the character, right? This is for your clients. Define who the character is. What are her objectives? What roles does she play on her team, right? It might be Jane is in market research. She's a consultant to her brand teams. She's looking for a partner to help her test and design some package options, right? This is the character that's there. Now, what you've got to do next is lay out the context in which Jane exists, because context is absolutely critical to the way Jane makes decisions. Jane, for her, insights are the platform upon which strategy is built. She's established herself as the megaphone for the voice of the customer within her organization, right? Now you understand the role insights play to her as a category, the role organizations like your own might play to her. In regards to how she expresses herself and the way she thinks about her identity within her organization. Now this is where it starts to get really fun, is then we identify that conflict, the tension there, right? We pinpoint the tensions between forces. It's not just Jane wants a report, but Jane wants a report and can't accomplish that goal because she's got these barriers in place. Right? We start to really clarify. Jane wants to provide a solid set of recommendations to her brand team and ultimately help transform the brand, but she sometimes has little influence among those marketers and their agencies, and is facing a reduced budget, a tight timeline, and a fleeting sense of fulfillment, right? So it's not just her goals, but the goals as they face the barriers, right? And what that means, what tension that creates. And really, when you focus on this is probably the one that's most important in regards to understanding them, is that you truly start to feel what they're experiencing. And if you can express that in a way that is meaningful and clear, they will acknowledge and recognize that you understand it as well. Number 4 is what I call the could be, right? Describe the aspirations of the client. What could be possible for Jane if she were to perhaps choose you or choose any service provider, really, but what you can do to separate that. So who does she want to be and how does she want to be seen? Jane wants to be lifted up on the shoulders of her peers while they shout hurrah. That may not actually happen, but she wants to feel that way. And she wants to be confident, the confident, sharp-witted professional who can impress her sister with a new package design at the holidays, right? For me, it always comes back to trying to explain to your family what you actually do. So she wants to be able to say, hey, I did that commercial you watched, or that brand you're seeing, and that thing you're enjoying, right? And finally, the last thing, and this is where it starts, you'll notice all of these are not about you yet, and there's an important point, right? But the conclusion is where you fit in. The conclusion is where you start to establish your role. How do you fit into Jane's narrative? How will you help transform her, right? Fictional agency Einstein is the spinach to her Popeye, right? It's the solid breakfast and a good night's sleep before the big meeting. They're there to help empower her through every step, and not only her own transformation, but her team's transformation as well, right? Now, how you do that, or all the services, the way you manage projects, the way you provide that report, or how you integrate yourself into her transformation. But once you're integrated into her transformation, loyalty goes up, right? And this is actually now, academic studies show this, that when you've become a part of someone else's narrative, and especially at the product level, consumers are more likely to choose, they're more likely to broaden the way in which they make decisions, so it's not just budget, timing, and output, but they will broaden to sort of relationship, value, experience with that person. You will find that there's greater benefit in choosing a second project and a lot more advocacy for your organization to others once you've become a part of their story. Some sort of ultimate tips, and the big tip I tell everyone when you're focusing on this relationship and even how to communicate this relationship is, remember, you are always the groomsman, never the groom. The client is always the hero of her narrative, right? right? And if the narrative that you're sharing begins to sort of focus on you and highlights your role solely, it's no longer her narrative anymore. And it's not that you can't communicate about yourself and have stories about your organization and your brand, but always ground that story in the client's narrative, right? How do you help transform them? What transformations have you gone through to help them transform, right? How can you connect to them? Ground it in their narrative, focus on their transformation. And if we do this, I am convinced if we do this, not just as organizations, but even the brands we serve, if they do this for their customers, we will play a more meaningful, positive role in their lives. I'll open up for questions now before we get to food. Thank you. Oh, I had one more GIF. There we go. Questions? And it stopped. Any? Or should we break for lunch?
So I can see this working. Oh, sorry. So I can totally imagine as you're talking, I've got a client, and I'm starting to answer all those questions of the 5 C's. But now the fact is, I want to have 100 in a month, or however many clients I can manage to work with.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for how you start maybe aggregating or recognize I can't be everything to all people, I can't transform the whole world?
Right. There was one of the sessions earlier, I think, was a really important tip from Keena's Mustard in the wonderful first inaugural presentation that he gave, which was, you're welcome. It's really important to focus your specialty, right? And especially, as he even showed the data, right, is people are specializing, I think, not just because the big houses are becoming either outpriced or out-timed or what have you. Clients, as the very, very first visual we saw at the morning of the day with the 5,000 different brands on that sheet, they need help making meaning of what's in the marketplace, right? And so when you do start to focus, when you say, I am a market researcher for craft beers, right? You begin to identify a narrative that they can consume. And when they can consume that, is you give them the thing that they can share with others. Right? Is, oh, what do? They do this, and they do it really well. Whereas if you say, oh, what does X do? They do a lot of things. And if it depends on if you need that, if you need this, and all of a sudden the story has a lot of caveats to it, right? So yes, I guess one answer to this question is as you start to identify patterns in your clients, you'll have a story that you're helping those patterns of clients with. And it might be 3 or 4 stories, and that's okay. But you can't be a story to everyone. And that's what I hope is okay too, so that we don't just add to the big list of logos on the page, but we actually start to make some of those logos really big because they play a more meaningful role in people's lives.
I want to ask a follow-up question, but also build on something that you just said, or build a question on what you just said. So one of the things that I'm finding and seeing is that the person that we're connecting with internally within the organization is needing to communicate our story up, not just 1 level anymore, but 2 or 3 levels above them now. And so what advice do you have as far as, I get be very clear about we do these 3 things, but beyond just sort of that level of clarity, is there anything from a tool perspective or sort of a way to engage that you would offer as support or advice?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways. There's one, from your own communication platform standpoint, make sure your story is really clear, right? Like who you are, that 1 line, that 280 character tweet, whatever it might be now. Make sure that's really clear so they know how to talk about you. But I think one thing we often miss is we produce the report for the client and there it is, or we produce even the proposal for the client and there it is. I think we have to go a step further and say, how do I help you produce your presentation now next, right? So they've got stakeholders to present to, and we produce it in our template, and we're really happy about it, and we lock it up or we PDF it so they can't change any of it, but they actually need to change it, and they need to make it their story, right? And that's where, as you look through, and I even think as you're developing taglines or even as you're writing the proposal, is don't just write the proposal from the perspective of how does this sound in regards to me and her, but how does this sound in regards to her and them? Even if it's just the way it's phrased, right? It's not just we're a really smart academic-driven design firm or research firm, what have you, but you are a academically driven market researcher within the organization, right? Then she can start to sell that up to others and provide the tools then that she's defending for budgets or what have you that will help accomplish that. And it might go even further, right? As this is a brand that will be driven by grounded academic, emotional insights, things like that. And you have to help them tell that story. So it's her story of transformation, but her story is about telling other stories as well. It's story on story on story, really. Sure.
Do you have any tips? So this presentation has been a lot, in my opinion, about like conversations and narratives, kind of this longer form. Mm-hmm. And I know we're having a whole panel on it later, but do you have any tips for shorter format? So actually in a tweet or an email or a first line, how would you convey narrative in a much smaller, condensed area?
Sure. So first a comment and then the tip. So the first comment is actually, I don't want you to take away that this is how you structure communications. I want you to think about this is how you structure relationships. When people ask me why I love my wife, or when my wife asks me why I love her, it's often a very bumbling sort of response, because it's hard to articulate that kind of thing. But if someone does, and I'm talking about my wife, I tell them the story about when we first met, and the life that we're building together, and the home that we have, and the Christmas decorations I'm going to put up in a few months, or a couple of weeks, really. But we talk about those stories. Now, when you're thinking about how do I take that to short form, the hardest thing to do is to write short. It's real easy to blab, as I'm probably doing now. The hardest thing is to condense that, but what I find, for example, Twitter actually and even at 140, was a really wonderful device for saying, what do I need to say? Is this thing that's in there driving the story forward in any way? And if not, am I just saying it because it makes me feel better to say I'm an academic that has a narrative psychology sort of background, things like that? Or is it driving the story forward? And then sort of what's easiest for them to re-say? And shorter is often better, right? The mind is a narrative machine. So if you give them the little blurb, and I'm sure you've all seen this in research that you may have conducted, right? You produce the 100-page report, but the director comes out of it saying, you remember that one interview where the guy said that this is like a box of chocolates, right? That's the one thing they remember because that's the short little story that brings it all together for them. So it's hard. There isn't like a one tip I can give you other than if it's not driving the story forward, take it out. Write it long first, but then see how, keep taking things out until you're at whatever size you want to be, or you're at the tightest you can be. And I always recommend, it's like the most common denominator of narratives. Find the most common denominator of your narrative, and then you can expand on that as much as you want from there. Is that my time?
One more question, if there's one.
I'd like lunch, personally.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, thank you so much.